Welcome to her remarkable history. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The awful abuse of Queen Victoria. When Victoria was just a child, she was next in line for the throne of Great Britain. Her uncle was King William IV, and he did not trust Victoria's mother or her evil adviser. You see, Victoria's father had died when she was young, and her mother, the Duchess of Kent, found herself relying on the assistance of a man named Sir John Conroy. He was the comptroller of the Duchess's household, and he essentially had her under his thumb. You see, he had promised to protect the Duchess after the death of the Duke of Kent, and soon she came to depend on him. But this was all detrimental to the then young Princess Victoria. She therefore experienced a childhood that was cruel and lacking of motherly love, which Victoria so desperately wanted. You see, Sir John monitored everything Victoria did, from what she ate, what she read, whom she played with, everything. Sir John was, essentially, the main reason why Victoria was almost completely cut off from the rest of the royal family. You see, it all boiled down to this. Sir John and the Duchess of Kent wanted two things. Victoria was going to be queen, but they wanted Sir John to become her private secretary, and for her mother, the Duchess, to become regent if the king died before Victoria became of age and turned 25. Victoria, however, repeatedly said no and turned the request down. She hated John Conroy, and she hated the effect that he had on her mother. However, due to Victoria's refusal, the Kensington System was born. This system had one aim: to make Victoria so reliant on her mother that the public would see no other option than to assign the Duchess as regent. The Kensington System was, in a sense, quite cruel. Maybe Sir John thought he was doing the right thing, but the mental strain it had on the then princess was horrendous. The system was for the young Victoria's personal safety. It demanded she be kept in semi-seclusion at Kensington Palace, behind the garden walls, and she'd be isolated from both disease and assassination attempts. Secondly, the fact that she was rarely seen at court distanced her, in people's minds, from the unpopular regime of her uncles, King George and then King William IV. As a possible future queen, she'd remain untainted by association with them. She would be a fresh start, or as Conroy put it, the nation's hope. But thirdly, and more sinisterly, the system also seemed to have been about breaking Victoria's spirit and getting her to submit to the will of both her mother and Sir John Conroy. It contained elements of surveillance. You see, Victoria had her every move closely monitored. She was not allowed to sleep alone, to walk around, or to even play with other children. And she was not allowed to walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand, and each day she had to write in her book, her behaviour book, about how well or badly she had behaved. Victoria's education was given by her mother. Nothing and no one should be able to tear the daughter away from her. Secondly, it was to give the Princess Victoria an upbringing which would enable her in the future to be equal of high position, and to win her so high a place in the hearts of her future subjects, even before her ascension, that she would assume the sceptre with a popularity never yet attained and rule with commensurate power. Now, at the age of 5, Victoria's education began. To start with, she was tutored by the Dean of Chester. He instructed her on scripture, and her mother would then, after every lesson, drill her. Then at 8, Victoria started to learn how to hold herself as a lady and decorum. She learnt how to read and write. She also learnt Greek and Latin, Italian, French and German. And a strict daily schedule was imposed by the Duchess, and morning lessons began at 9:30. She'd then have a break around 11:30, and then at 3 o'clock things would resume, and this would last until 5. The system, however, was an utter failure, and Victoria grew to hate her mother because of it. You see, Victoria was never allowed to be apart from her mother, or her tutor, or her governess. She was kept apart from other children, and both her mother and Sir John would strictly monitor and record her every movement and action, and also decided whom she was allowed to meet with. During her childhood, Victoria was only allowed to have 2 play friends, Princess Theodora, her half-sister, and the daughter of Sir John, Victorie, although she didn't particularly get along with Sir John's daughter. Now, Victoria was also unable to leave the grounds of the palace in which she called her home. On only 2 recorded occasions was she able to visit Claremont to see her uncle Leopold I of Belgium. It was this visit that greatly influenced Victoria's opinion on the system, and as previously mentioned, when the Duchess and Sir John knew that Victoria would soon inherit the throne, they threatened her to try and obtain some sort of power for themselves, but Victoria was stronger than that, and she stood her ground. As said, King William did not trust the Duchess or Sir John, and he made this known at his last birthday meal, a birthday which would be his last. He shouted how the Duchess had evil advisers, and in turn the Duchess left the room in a huff, and the young Victoria was left in tears. Victoria, as she grew into her late teens, had finally had enough of her mother and Sir John. Since a young age she had been restricted by the following 8 rules of the Kensington System. Rule number 1. Victoria was not allowed to spend time by herself, and she always had to sleep in her mother's room. Rule number 2. Victoria could not walk downstairs without holding the hand of an adult, in case she fell. 3. Victoria was not allowed to meet any strangers or third parties without her governess being present. Rule number 4. Victoria had to write in a behaviour book about how well she'd behaved, and as such her mother could assess her progress. Rule number 5. Victoria could only appear in public on carefully stage-managed publicity tours. This, as I said, was to distance her from the unpopular regime of her uncles, and to present her as the nation's hope. Rule number 6. Victoria was not allowed to dance the scandalous and intimate new dance called the waltz. Victoria therefore never waltzed until she married Prince Albert. Rule number 7. Victoria had to build up her strength by exercising with her Indian clubs and a machine with pulleys and weights, and was mandated to have plenty of fresh air. She would be a lifelong devotee of open windows, to the extent that her courtiers would always be shivering. And finally, rule number 8. Victoria was not allowed to gorge on food. She was allowed to eat bread and milk and plain roast mutton, and was restricted from eating her favourite things such as sweetmeats and fruit. Now, as Victoria approached her 18th birthday, King William IV, her uncle, offered Victoria her own household and an allowance. This did not go down very well with Sir John or the Duchess, and they were furious. Then, on the 20th of June 1837, the King, William, died, and Victoria became Queen at last. Now, her first actions as Queen, interestingly, were quite simple. She was now Queen, and she could finally have her freedom from her mother and Sir John. All of her life, Victoria had shared a bedroom with the Duchess, and she now wanted her bed and all of her things moved into her own room. And secondly, she wanted some time to herself. She ordered that for an hour a day she would be able to go on independent walks. The home-loving Victoria would become the perfect pin-up for a country tired of the debauchery and excesses of a previous king. The damage had been done in terms of the Queen's relationship with her mother. She refused to change her mother's rank and did not want Sir John as her private secretary. It was only when Victoria married and had children that the relationship somewhat defrosted. The Duchess was a doting grandmother, and upon the death of Sir John Conroy, the Duchess of Kent wrote to Victoria, He has been of great use to me, but unfortunately has also done great harm. Victoria said to her mother in response that the days she spoke about were in the past, and therefore long forgotten. When the Duchess of Kent was ill in 1859, a worried Victoria wrote to her uncle, King Leopold I of Belgium, "I hardly myself knew how I loved her, or how my whole existence seems bound up with her, till I saw looming in the distance the fearful possibility of what I will not mention." The Duchess recovered this time, but her fatal illness came in the March of 1861. Victoria sat by her mother's bedside on a footstool and held her hand, and when she realised that she had stopped breathing. The Duchess of Kent died on the 16th of March 1861. Albert took Victoria into the next room, and a devastated Victoria wrote to her uncle, King Leopold, "On this most dreadful day of my life does your poor heart-broken child write one line of love and devotion. She is gone." Victoria cried for weeks and deeply regretted their estrangement. So Victoria grew up under a regime of strict rules that essentially took her childhood from her. She wished her mother had been more doting and less under the control of an evil man, and even in the end, after everything, she wished she and her mother could have been better together. After the birth of her children, Victoria really got to know her mother, the mother she could have been. There is no doubt that Conroy was indeed a manipulative bully, but there is also something more to his poor reputation among historians than just Victoria's well-recorded dislike. The snobbish court establishment looked down on his lack of aristocratic background. Sir John Conroy had obtained his position all from his own efforts, something that over time many have found quite troubling. The system had three parts essentially, and eventually the first two were successful. Victoria was kept safe, and through all the carefully planned and staged public appearances, Victoria, once Queen, was met with an enormous amount of warmth. And sadly, but possibly true, you could argue that although the harsh upbringing of Victoria did not in fact break her, it was in fact the making of her reign. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.